Today on Pilot's Discretion, we're joined by Scott Manley, a popular YouTube astronomer and a Cirrus pilot. He tells us about learning to fly, using simulators for airplanes and space, and what it was like to ride the Vomit Comet. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, pilots. I'm your host, John Zimmerman of Sporties, and thanks for listening. Remember to visit sporties.com/podcast for show links and complete archives, and send your comments to podcast@sporties.com. Pilot's Discretion is all about meeting interesting people from diverse backgrounds whose only common thread is often aviation, and today is a great example of that. Scott Manley has been described as a scientist, a gamer, an astrophysicist, a software engineer, a DJ, and a YouTube star, which is quite a list. He earned degrees in astronomy and computational physics in Scotland before moving to California, where he now works at a major technology company. In his spare time, he maintains a YouTube channel with over 1.5 million subscribers, where he mixes hardcore science with gaming. But as of this year, I am happy to add pilot to his long list of accomplishments as he started flight training in a Cirrus SR20. Scott, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Hello. I'm very happy to be here. And I really lit up when you said pilot, because it's driving me right now.
Well, that's great. So let's talk about that. You've done so many interesting things in life, software, asteroids, everything in between. Why did you decide to become a pilot? Why did that jump to the top of the list?
So I was always aviation adjacent. Some of my earliest memories would be going to Prestwick Airport in Scotland, where I grew up, and watching Concorde take off, because occasionally they would land there when it was fogged in. My dad did a bit of glider stuff. I never saw him do that, but I was always fascinated by flying things. And another side was, 4 years old, I saw Star Wars, and I wanted to be Luke Skywalker. Now, obviously I'm not Luke Skywalker, but I am now flying things over over Skywalker Ranch. So there is that. It just took a long time, but eventually I got here.
And so what has surprised you about that process, coming in with maybe some of that scientific background and aviation adjacent, but it's always a bit of a culture shock, at least I think so. So what surprised you about the learning to fly process? Any myths you've discovered along the way?
Well, okay, what surprised me initially was how easy the written test is. And I've been told that it's much harder in other countries. But one of the first things I did was I've downloaded one of these mock tests and sort of went through it and realized that without any training, I passed it. Because there's just a lot of basic physics and stuff in the aerodynamics. But what has, really humbled me is being just actually flying and simply staying coordinated and remembering to, pull your body together and make all that happen. That has been the hard part. It has been a process of doing great at one thing and not doing great at the other, and trying to find where I can use my strengths.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of listeners can relate to. Aviation, no matter how many hours you have, can humble you. Just when you think you have it figured out, a new challenge comes along and humbles you a little bit. But you do have that maybe cheat code there of having a background in physics that not every pilot has. Does that help you? When you're flying along, do you apply your knowledge about physics to flying? Do you have some scientific tip that can help us all make better landings?
The understanding the physics meant that I was going into some of the early ground schools and getting told stuff about aerodynamics and trying to then explain my physics background version and spending 20 minutes with this really complicated diagram of vectors before I realized I just needed to say that this one goes sideways. But it's with the ground schools, I sort of was. My strategy for learning all the aviation stuff was just going through and watching, all the ground schools I could find, including Sporties, which that's the one that signed off on my written test. And I went through everybody I could find, and some of them are better than others. And it was great to just have them on in the background. Sometimes I would find them saying things that weren't actually correct, according to the laws of physics, but ultimately, the physics really just helped me understand, how aerodynamics works, how I should be talking about the aerodynamics, and understanding just simply exchanging energy, because physics is all about energy exchange. But I've got to be clear, there's one thing to know, that you can lose altitude and gain speed. There's another to be in that situation and remember, I'm a little high and a little slow, I should go down rather than applying power, right? There's things that you know from years of academic training and things that you need to know how to apply in the moment.
So a common debate we'll have as pilots is what actually turns the airplane. And I'm interested in with your physics background, what you think. Is it the horizontal component of lift? Is it the rudder? Is it something else? Is it both? Where do you land on that debate?
It's a combination of both, right? The horizontal component of the lift is applied forward of the center of pressure because of the tailplane. So it's going to pull the front of the plane around as you're applying that lateral deflection in the lift. Don't ask me to tell you how lift actually works on a plane, because there's the Bernoulli's principle and there's the Newtonian principle, and there are both places where they both don't work. The only true answer is you use, the Navier-Stokes equation and solve it for whatever wing surface you're using.
Yeah, we had Katie Mack on this show earlier this year, astrophysicist, and asked her about Bernoulli versus Newton, and she didn't even accept the premise really. So I'm not going to tiptoe around that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing for us as pilots to understand is that a lot of the lift for at least subsonic flight comes from low pressure air over the top of the wing, and when you get to a critical angle of attack and you lose that, that's when you're stalling and you're losing that. Everything else is kind of circumspect and theoretical or whatever, but just knowing that you have to keep that air attached to the top of the wing to get best performance, that's what we should be aware of as pilots.
So you're also a software engineer. That's your day job. And I'm curious what area of aviation you think is crying out for better software. Is it just for you who's used to maybe a different type of software with less government regulation over what's certified? Is it just painful to use most aviation software, or are there some bright spots?
Most aviation software is it's very hard to change very quickly because of the regulations. Certainly, it's fantastic that we now have these electronic flight bags like, ForeFlight. Everybody's bringing iPads with them. But I think one of the problems I see with software in aviation is that so much of it is proprietary, and anyone building a flight simulator has to guess at what the software is doing. There's no case where you can actually run the production software on your, aviation training device. So there's going to be differences there. And I can't think of any software, simulation of an aircraft which properly does all the avionics to the point where you can find the bugs in the software.
You brought up simulators, so let's talk about that, because that's a huge part of what you do on YouTube. Your channel really kind of got started with the Kerbal Space Program, and you've shown, I think, how a game like that can be quite educational. And you wrote I thought, a great line. You said, quote, "I think games have always provided learning experiences, and more importantly, they haven't needed to try to be educational to do so. In fact, games that try to teach you things are usually very poor games," unquote. So how do you think simulators do at that? I mean, you mentioned they're not always true to life on the avionics side of it, but in general, are flight simulators games? Are they learning tools? Are they both? What's your experience?
I would say, why not both, right? You can absolutely have a lot of fun in flight simulators, and I have multiple flight simulators. I have Microsoft Flight Sim, and I have X-Plane 11 and 12, and I tend to fly my training in X-Planes. I tend to be very careful, do my flight planning, and go out and try to enter the correct traffic pattern. And then I'll mess around in Microsoft Flight Simulator, screaming down, Skywalker, Star Wars transition in the Mojave, flying down canyons ridiculously fast under bridges. Very stupid stuff. I actually managed to roll the Spruce Goose, which was an experience. I think to make it an effective training device, you have to use it in the context that you're going to be, actually flying the real thing. And one of the things I have done is when my instructor has told me, we're going to plan for a cross country to this location, I've gone out and I've flown it. And the most helpful thing from that has been knowing the scenery on the way there and picking out the airport or the airfield ahead. And, because I've seen it in the sim, I know the context of the area around it, and I can pick that out very early and begin planning how I'm going to maneuver into it. And just having it in my head from having practiced it. So, yeah, if you're going to use the simulator as a training device, you got to absolutely fly as fly it like you would fly it in real life. And also, set it up to push the limits. It's actually, I find it quite useful to have very high failure rates set so that sometimes I am dealing with something that I got to pull out the checklist to work around. I think I've had a half a dozen engine failures, and they're all, quite entertaining when you have them in a sim, and terrifying, I'm sure, in real life.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially maybe for pilots who grew up on an older generation of simulators. They don't understand the value of how good the scenery is now and how valuable that is. We do that in our flight school here at Sporty's, where you can fly cross country in the sim and really get a feel for, there's a railroad track there that leads into that town. And that's one of my visual checkpoints that you just could never do on earlier simulators. So that's a great tip for people who maybe haven't been in a sim in a while.
I'm going to say, by the way, that if you're flying in a sim, one of the most important things for me is being able to talk to air traffic control. And I use Pilot Edge when I can. And it, I'll do this. I know how to make my first call to ATC, and then they'll read back a clearance, and I will just be like a deer in the headlights, forgetting everything. And getting over that, I'm still working on, but it has been exceptionally useful. And one of the favorite things I've done in a flight sim this year was the Sim Venture, where we, and hundreds of other pilots, we were all flying into Oshkosh with the actual, Oshkosh controllers. And, you're just basically following along in a line, but you've got these controllers going a mile a minute, and you're trying to, maintain spacing. It was, easily the most entertaining thing I've done in a simulator.
Yeah, that's an absolutely fantastic event. I like to see more of that happening with some of those tools that connect pilots. So great way to take your sim to the next level. I'm also interested what you think on the Cirrus SR20, because that's the airplane you're training in. Not unheard of to train in that these days, but maybe a little unusual. How has that experience been in that airplane?
Well, again, I said it was humbling. It's definitely harder than I expected. So the reason why I'm training in an SR20 is sort of earlier in the year, I had this moment where it's like, I gotta start training. I'm turning 50 soon, so I gotta really get this done. And I started looking at all the sort of local flight schools and looking around for training. And I'm gonna say, like, a lot of the flight schools, their websites were like from 2003. Some of them had phone numbers that didn't work, but I got through this, and I kept on getting told, "Oh, we got no room for you." I went up as far as Petaluma, which is an hour's drive for me, and yet nobody had any room except for at Noss Field in Novato. They had Scanlon Aviation, and they had room, but they only trained in Cirrus. So it was like, do I train in a Cirrus now, or do I wait 6 months potentially for somewhere, or do I spend hours and hours driving every time I want to fly? And I'm in the position where I am time poor, but reasonably well off in terms of cash. And frankly, I really want to fly the Cirrus ultimately. It looks like it's a great plane. I enjoy it. It has all the features that I actually want from a modern aircraft. So I've never really spent any time training in anything else. I've flown other aircraft, in the right seat with friends, and I still love the Cirrus. It is sometimes the technology is somewhat getting in the way sometimes, where I'm like, I want to tune to this frequency, and I know the frequency in my head, but my instructor really wants me to show that I can go into the navigation map and pull that out there and assign it to the correct, to the correct radio frequency and everything. And the other thing is, because there's so many features, when you're coming up with training plans, frequently I'll say, well, let's not use GPS. Let's find some other way to do this, because we want to exercise all the different skills, all the different capabilities. Let's not use this airfield as a navigation point. Let's actually use the VOR even though there's no need for me to actually learn this, it's something I really want to have. I want to learn how to actually do that within this aircraft that's almost all GPS. So yeah, I've gone in. It's I think it's 215 horsepower, so that's technically a high power already from day one. And it is definitely taking me longer than I would have if I'd, say, flown in a Cessna. But I'm loving every minute of it. And my wife's quite happy because, she looks and she sees that there's a parachute on it, so she's a lot more comfortable with it.
Your experience probably isn't that unique in the sense of the later in life, you're as you said, time poor. There's different personalities out there with student pilots and what their priorities are. But for that later in life learner like you, where maybe time is the bigger constraint than money, what's your advice there in terms of getting it done? I know there's lots of people who dream about it, who think about it, who struggle to actually get over the hump. So what's your advice to those people?
Well, so my advice is, first of all, get started soon, but also find the times to do learning when you're doing something else. I spend a lot of time hiking, and I would always be playing aviation lessons of some sort. I think, as I said, I listened to like every single ground school I could find. In fact, right now, I've gone past all the PPL ground schools and are now listening to all the IFR and multi-engine. Not because I expect to do that right away, but because it's actually kind of useful to hear the context of other pilots. So yeah, use whatever time you have, to continue to advance you. I think if you're like me, it's probably good to have simulator time because it's gonna take time just to get to an airfield. So if you can you can't log it, but if you can practice something in a sim, that will definitely inform your lessons. Just make sure that it's not something that's detracting from being a good pilot. Let's say don't mess around. Actually practice things. Yeah, get it started as quickly as possible.
Scott, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk about YouTube.
An in-flight emergency is no time for an instruction manual. That's why the pilots at Sporty's designed the easy-to-use PJ2 Plus comm radio, the only portable with built-in aviation headset jacks. In an emergency, you can plug right in and stay focused on flying. The PJ2 also includes a 3.5mm jack that's perfect for air shows and 6 watts of peak output power for maximum transmit range. Visit sportys.com/PJ2 to order. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Scott Manley, who is known by millions for his YouTube channel, mostly space, but increasingly some aviation content as well. And Scott, YouTube has been a tremendous help for pilots over the last decade. I'm sure you've seen that in your training. But like anything online, the quality of content can vary sometimes. And in aviation, sometimes that can lead to bad or even unsafe ideas being shared. So what's your process as a real expert at this for evaluating a video or a channel? What are you looking for? What's some tips for the rest of us pilots out there who are looking for some high quality aviation content?
Oh boy, this is very hard for me to judge, but I started out watching authoritative sources like MIT and their ground school. So, I started from things that had a lot of views that were putting out sort of consistent content. And then I sort of started moving out to peripheries. And yes, I saw a lot of stuff that I'm like, that doesn't look particularly safe. I think the important thing for me is to have people that are able to talk a lot and explain things rather than, it's nice to see visuals, but if I can't just listen to it without the visuals, then that's not really something that I consider to be a great learning thing. You know what I mean? I find that if you can listen to it without the visuals, then that's a good sign the content is pretty good quality. I mean, having said that, I see there's a lot of ground schools on YouTube, and I've seen a few mistakes in them. Like one of my favorite ones that I hear repeated is talking about humidity in the air, and there's a few ground schools that say that warm air holds more moisture because there's more space between the atoms. And that just, it's like, no, that's wrong. You've learned that from somebody and you're repeating it. That's because if that was true, then low pressure air would hold more moisture than high pressure air, which is not actually what happens. There's a few things that seem to have, and I think this is not confined to YouTube, by the way. I think this is more just general, instructors passing takes down. I think one of the most important things in anybody that's teaching anything is to know when to say that they don't know an answer and to actually figure out the answer and come back with it. And, if your instructor knows everything, be very suspicious.
That is tremendously good advice. The ability to say "I don't know" is a superpower in modern life. But we'll all be looking forward to the Scott Manley 45-minute video on describing how lift actually works. I am ready for that whenever you're ready.
Let me tell you, the story they tell you about the critical angle never changing on speed, that is technically not correct. But for everyone that's watching this or listening to this, it's almost certainly correct for any speed you're flying at.
You once said, quote, "Don't make videos because you want to be famous. Don't do this because you expect to make money." You obviously have been tremendously successful doing it, though. You've crossed that 1 million subscriber mark and left it behind. So why should someone start a YouTube channel? Why did you do it?
I had things I wanted to share, and it was a great way to share it. And I was lucky that I picked up an audience from what I had initially posted. And then at just the right time, this Kerbal Space Program video game came along, and I was in this position with just enough an audience and enough knowledge that I could start, playing the game, but also teaching things. And I had people just asking me, but the main thing is, if you have something worth sharing and you think you can do it, it's definitely worth your time, because you learn a lot just by teaching. I think that teaching is actually a very good way to learn a subject. And I would actually advise that if you're learning to fly, maybe spend some time trying to teach the stuff back to your instructor. And, you might realize where your misunderstandings are coming from. Yeah, don't make videos on YouTube. Don't try to become a personality on social media because you think it's easy or because it's something that's going to happen. It's a sort of a plan B. It's something that's great if it works, but if it doesn't, you should have other ideas and do other things. I see this to students, kids these days who want to become influencers. It's like, great, but you should definitely have another career lined up. I like to tell a story of Leland Melvin, who's an astronaut, and he wanted to be a football player, and he was selected for the NFL and then injured. But while he was at college, he did aerospace engineering and then ultimately became an astronaut. So that's one hell of a plan B. Yeah,
that's good advice for pilots too. You'll often hear seasoned airline pilots give that advice, that aviation's a fantastic career, but it doesn't hurt to have a plan B ready to go just in case you hit one of those furlough cycles. So, Scott, a few questions about space before we get to our Ready to Copy segment, and a topic you obviously know quite well. So as we record here in December 2022, NASA has finally launched its SLS. SpaceX is landing rockets on floating pads. There are private spaceflight companies in India that are gathering steam. Are we in a new era for spaceflight, or is this mostly just industry hype?
Oh, I think we're definitely in a new era. The fact is that SLS did just launch, and it was largely a product of politics to keep, shuttle jobs in the same states. But in the last 10 years or so that it's been, slowly developing at the cost of $4 billion per launch, SpaceX has come along, and they've been taking government money, but the contracts are different. The contracts are basically, we will pay you this amount to fly this stuff to space. And just by working within those limitations, without the hard political, without the assumption that the politician will always renew your program, they've managed to build a very successful and very efficient launch company. And now, private people can pay to fly on a SpaceX rocket. We've had 2 passenger flights, 2 tourist flights on SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft. Last year there was Inspiration 4, and this year there was Axiom 1, and that's 8 people went to orbit. It is. The pricing has changed. The capabilities have changed. And, we're moving forwards. Now, whether we'll be on Mars in 20 years, I think that's very much open to question. But I hope that I hope that it just this continual pushing forwards is going to reduce costs further, and we'll get more opportunity for people like me to maybe fly one day.
NASA is no longer the monopoly when it comes to launches, as you just mentioned. So its role is definitely evolving, even changing radically. If you were in charge, what would you have NASA do? Would you have them actually launch rockets, work with other companies, fund research, something else entirely? What would you do?
NASA is a customer, right? They are the ones that are supposed to be pushing the limits of technology. And as we have got to the point where it's not difficult. Well, it is difficult, but it's not impossible for private companies to build the rockets and provide those services to NASA. And that's what NASA is largely doing. They're using commercial launch providers, and they're basically providing the market for these launch providers to get the investment to make it worth them to develop their own rockets. SLS is a strange example because it's entirely mandated by politicians outside of NASA, basically saying, you're going to do this, here's the money for it. If you don't want to do this, you're not getting the money. So, NASA is largely doing the right thing when it's allowed to do what it wants. And, the same is true for, European Space Agency. They're starting to pay for external services. So it's just been a sort of restructuring of what's going on. And NASA should be doing the science and industry should be doing the launches.
Okay, Scott, we're down to our final segment, which we call Ready to Copy. I'll ask a bunch of questions on a variety of topics, and you give me your quick answer. So are you ready to copy?
I am ready to copy.
You got to fly the Vomit Comet and experience zero-G. It's a great video on YouTube for folks to watch. We can link to it in the show notes here. Describe that experience to us.
Uplifting. It's fantastic. It's just the weirdest situation where you're just floating around. But what I find more fascinating was the fact that you could feel the plane just moving around you as it pitched over. I was almost more interested in talking to the pilots afterwards because it was this amazing old 727 that had been specially modified for this. And it was all steam gauges doing, at the front and just white padding 2001 at the back. It was a fascinating, fascinating flight.
Your most famous catchphrase, or at least one of them, is fly safe. So what's a lesson from the space world that pilots should adopt to fly safe?
Avoid normalization of deviance. If something is not behaving, you shouldn't assume that it is normal. You shouldn't push that to the back of your mind, right? There's a reason why you're supposed to inop in placard instruments.
Great lesson. Go read the Challenger report for anyone who wants to go deep into that rabbit hole. What do you make of the U.S. Navy videos that show these unidentified aerial phenomena? Are we being visited by aliens?
I think that every time we look at these, we eventually find a problem or we find an explanation which is much more terrestrial. I would love to be proven wrong, but right now everything I see has always been explained away by more mundane stuff. But one of these days, maybe we'll be proven wrong and it will be either wonderful or terrifying. Hopefully wonderful.
Can you see a laser pointer from the International Space Station?
I did the math on this, and for a sufficiently bright laser pointer, yes. But the hard thing is pointing it at the International Space Station when it's still dark, when the space station is still at night.
And to be clear, nobody go try this because you'll probably light up an airplane while you do it, and that's a big, big problem. So
this is all hypothetical. At planes. Yes.
If you could go back and fly on any space mission in history, what would it be?
Oh, God, it would have to be one of the Apollo missions to the surface of the moon. There's very few places where pilots actually, were directly involved in the landing to the extent that they were on the Apollo missions. And getting to another world just sounds absolutely amazing. And it's an exceptional amount of work. But I think the hardest part about Apollo, of course, is having to use the Apollo bags for the bathroom. I lie. Flying is difficult. These things.
Do you think the Earth's oceans were started by a meteorite, as a popular theory now suggests?
Definitely impacts on the Earth shaped the world and probably delivered a lot of the volatiles. I think that very likely early on we lost a lot of the volatiles and then they were replenished. But there's a lot of different ways this could happen. So it's not one meteorite. It would be many, many meteorites.
If an asteroid were headed for Earth tomorrow, how confident are you we could stop it? There's been some work on this recently, right? Is this something that's progressing, or is this all for show?
Well, if we discovered it tomorrow and it was going to impact tomorrow, we couldn't stop it. But if we discovered it tomorrow and it was going to hit 20, 30 years from now, I'm confident that there are ways that we could solve that problem. Change the plans the universe has set for us. And yeah, we saw the DART mission just last year. It was launched, and earlier this year they hit an asteroid and they gave it a bump and they changed its speed by centimeters per second, which over time adds up.
You worked at Napster for a while, and you're also a fairly accomplished DJ in your long and crazy resume. So we need a music recommendation. Scott, give us an underrated, obscure artist we should all be listening to.
Oh man, underrated. That's a hard one. I'm going to say that I like to listen to right now Test Shot Starfish, and they actually are the people that do the music for the SpaceX live streams. And it's just this sort of instrumental background music with a lot of, it just feels like flying. So if I make videos about flying, frequently I'll put that on in the background because it just sounds so good.
The new pilot soundtrack. I like that. Great suggestion. If I'm going to Scotland and I don't want to play golf, where should I go and what should I do?
You should go in August to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, just because there's so many crazy shows going on. But if you're a scientist, I would also suggest going to Glasgow and going to Glasgow University. They have museums there with both. Well, basically, Lord Kelvin was at University of Glasgow. He was taught there. And they have some of his original instrumentation. So there's a lot of amazing stuff to be found if you're into science. And they also have the Transportation Museum, yes, which has some cool planes.
Our last question is always the same. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Well, since I can only fly Cirrus right now, it would have to be a Cirrus SR20 probably. And I think I would be flying down the California coast through Big Sur, just off the coast, past Monterey, down into Pismo Beach, and then into the airspace just beyond Vandenberg's TFR to watch a rocket launch from the air on my plane. I think that would be pretty cool.
Sounds better than pretty cool. Sounds fantastic. Scott, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you. And of course, fly safe.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.